In the prestigious corridors of Emerald Valley High School, Bisi Alabi was a name that sparked both admiration and envy. The school uniform, a crisp white shirt and a short red skirt with thin black stripes, seemed made for her. With flawless ebony skin, deep-set eyes that sparkled with mischief, and legs that seemed to go on forever, Bisi was a living, breathing goddess in the eyes of her classmates. Every step she took on her polished black shoes turned heads. Every laugh that escaped her lips caused girls to whisper. But beneath her radiant beauty and the mask of perfection was a girl hiding a deep, dangerous secret. Bisi was the top student in her class. At least, that's what everyone thought. She breezed through exams, always achieving straight A's, and teachers constantly praised her in front of the other students. Girls in the hostel would lie on their beds, staring up at the ceiling fan, wondering how Bisi managed to have it all. "She must read all night," one girl would say in awe. "I bet she doesn't sleep," another would add, convinced that hard work was the key to Bisi's success. What they didn't know was that Bisi's secret wasn't long hours of study or exceptional intelligence. It was something far darker, something that would shatter her carefully curated image if anyone ever found out. In truth, Bisi struggled with her studies. No matter how hard she tried, the numbers on her maths test blurred. The literature essays seemed like jumbled words, and the science formulas felt like a foreign language. Her mind couldn't keep up, but her beauty had always been her greatest weapon. The first time it happened was during her third term in SS2. Mr. Johnson, her English teacher, had called her into his office after class. His office smelled of musty textbooks and stale coffee, the old fan lazily turning above them. He had asked her about her poor grades on a recent essay, and Bisi had felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't fail. She wouldn't let herself. "I know you're trying, Bisi," Mr. Johnson had said, leaning forward, his voice soft. "But you need to work harder if you want to succeed." It was then that Bisi leaned in closer, her lips curling into a smile that she knew no man could resist. "I can do better, sir," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I just need guidance." The look in his eyes had told her everything she needed to know. That night, after the rest of the students had gone to bed, she had returned to Mr. Johnson's office. What happened behind that closed door wasn't studying, but by the time she left, Bisi knew she had secured an A in English. Bisi quickly realized the power her beauty held over her male teachers. One by one, she found ways to charm them, to make them believe she was more than just a pretty face. Mr. Bello, the math teacher, was the next. He was stern, always quick to scold students for getting answers wrong on the board. But when Bisi approached him after school one day, biting her lower lip nervously and asking for extra help, his demeanor softened. It wasn't long before she was visiting his office after school hours too. The pattern became familiar, flirting and late-night visits, where she traded her body for grades. With each encounter, she climbed higher in her class ranking. Her A's in subjects she barely understood were a testament to the unspoken agreement she had forged with her lecturers. To the other students, Bisi was a role model. They envied her intelligence, her seemingly effortless academic success, and the way every teacher adored her. They had no idea of the price she was secretly paying behind closed doors. The girls in the hostel constantly marveled at Bisi. They shared the same dormitory, wore the same uniforms, yet Bisi seemed untouchable. Whenever she returned to the hostel, after one of her late study sessions, they would bombard her with questions. "Bisi, how do you do it? How do you always get A's?" A girl named Funke had asked one night, her eyes wide with curiosity. Bisi only smiled, her lips twisted into something between amusement and pity. "I just focus," she lied effortlessly. "You have to put in the extra effort." The girls nodded in agreement, never suspecting that Bisi's version of extra effort was far different from what they imagined. Funke admired Bisi, always trying to follow in her footsteps, asking to study with her or borrow her notes. But Bisi, ever the master of deception, would shrug her off with excuses. "I study better alone," she would say, her eyes flickering with the knowledge that no one would ever truly know the depths of her deceit. Over time, Bisi's influence extended to nearly all the male teachers. Mr. Adewale, her chemistry teacher, was the hardest to crack. He was strict, barely looked students in the eye, and kept a professional distance, but Bissy knew how to play the game. She began answering questions in class, her voice sweet and innocent, her uniform skirt just a little shorter than usual. She would linger by his desk after class, asking questions about chemical reactions, her eyes always looking with his a little longer than necessary. It wasn't long before Mr. Adewale called her into his office after class one day. The conversation was about her interest in the subject, but Bissy knew where it would lead. That night, her chemistry grade shot up from a C to an A. Soon, Bissy had control over nearly every male teacher in the school. Mr. Bello, Mr. Adewale, Mr. Johnson, they all played their part in maintaining her grades, all while she maintained her innocence faculty to the rest of the school. But maintaining her web of lies wasn't easy. Bissy began to feel the weight of her choices, pressing down on her. The late night visits, the constant pretending. It was exhausting. There were nights when she would lie on her dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all worth it. She could no longer look at her fellow students without feeling a deep sense of shame. Funke, who still looked up to her, would never understand. To them, she was brilliant, untouchable, a role model, but Bissy knew the truth. She wasn't the academic star they thought she was. She was simply good at playing a game, one that left her feeling empty and hollow. Despite the emptiness inside, Bissy continued. She had come too far to stop now. Bissy's delicate web was nearly exposed one evening when she overheard a conversation between two other teachers in the staff room. She had arrived to meet Mr. Johnson, but instead heard snippets of a conversation between Mr. Bello and Mrs. Ajayi, the vice principal. There are rumors going around about inappropriate relationships between some of the male teachers and a student. Mrs. Ajayi was saying, her voice stern. We can't allow this kind of behavior in our school. Bissy froze, her heart racing in her chest. She knew they couldn't be talking about anyone but her. You don't think it's true, do you? Mr. Bello asked, his voice filled with fake innocence. I don't know, Mrs. Ajayi replied, her voice hard, but I will find out. Bissy slipped away quietly, her palms sweating. She couldn't let this happen. Her entire reputation, her future was on the line. Bissy knew she had to act fast. She couldn't risk being caught, not when she was so close to graduating with perfect grades. The next morning, she arranged to meet Mr. Johnson and Mr. Bello separately outside the school grounds. She had to make sure they wouldn't betray her and had to ensure their silence. With a mixture of charm, manipulation, and veiled threats, she managed to convince them to keep quiet. But it was a dangerous game she was playing, and she knew it wouldn't be long before someone uncovered the truth. Despite the tension building inside her, Bissy maintained her perfect image at school. She continued to flash that disarming smile, continued to sit at the front of the class, and answer questions with confidence. She was still the girl everyone envied, the one all the teachers adored. But inside, she felt like she was walking on thin ice. As the final exams approached, Bissy's anxiety reached a breaking point. There was no guarantee her secret wouldn't unravel. Late at night, she would lie awake, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She had spent years building this false image of herself, and now it felt as though it could all crumble at any moment. On the day of her final exam, she sat in the classroom, her pen shaking in her hand. She knew that no matter what happened, her life would never be the same. The clock was ticking, and the final exam was about to begin. Bissy sat in her seat, staring at the exam paper that had just been placed in front of her. Her mind was racing, but not with the questions on the page. Instead, she was thinking about Mr. Bello. Earlier that morning, he had sent her a text message that shook her to her core. Come to my office before your exam. We need to talk. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to speak to Mrs. Ajayi. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read the message over and over again. Mrs. Ajayi, the no-nonsense vice principal, had already been suspicious. Bissy had overheard her conversations in the staff room. If Mr. Bello exposed her, everything would fall apart. She glanced at the exam paper in front of her again. Her classmate had already begun writing furiously. Time was running out, and so were her options. She couldn't focus. Her hands trembled as she made a split-second decision. Without a word, Bissy stood up, clutching her pencil case as a distraction, and hurried out of the exam hall. Her mind was made up. She had to see Mr. Bello and make sure he stayed silent, no matter the cost. Bissy dashed across the school courtyard, her heart thudding in her chest, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. The white shirt of her uniform clung to her back, and her red skirt with black stripes brushed against her legs as she moved faster than she had ever run before. Mr. Bello's office was on the far side of the school grounds, in a secluded corner, near the staff quarters. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds. Students were scattered around, most unaware of the battle Bissy was waging within herself. When she reached the door to Mr. Bello's office, she hesitated just for a moment. She knew what was expected of her. She had done it before, but something about that day felt different. This wasn't just about securing an A in chemistry anymore. This was about her entire future. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly on the door. "Come in," came Mr. Bello's voice, smooth and confident as ever. Bissy entered, closing the door behind her. Mr. Bello sat at his desk, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips as he gestured for her to sit down. The fan in the corner of the office hummed softly, cutting through the tension in the air. "I told you I needed to see you," Mr. Bello said, his eyes lingering on her uniform. Bissy bit her lip, knowing that time was ticking, knowing that her classmates were scribbling answers in the exam hall while she sat there, battering her dignity once again. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll do anything. Just don't go to Mrs. Ajayi." Mr. Bello stood and walked around the desk, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. Bissy felt a cold wave of shame wash over her, but she forced herself to stay still. She had to endure this. Just 30 minutes, she told herself. 30 minutes, and she could go back to her exam, and her secrets would be safe. The door to the office clicked shut behind them, and Bissy's heart sank lower into her chest. The weight of her decisions pressed down on her like a mountain, but she knew there was no going back now. She could hear the ticking of the wall clock, each second a reminder of what she was sacrificing. Time slipped away as Bissy buried her feelings, trying to silence the screaming voice inside her head that told her she deserved better than this, that she was more than the sum of these moments in dim offices. But fate had other plans. As the minutes passed, the door to Mr. Bello's office suddenly swung open with a loud creak. Bissy and Mr. Bello both froze, their eyes snapping toward the door in horror. Standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and disgust, was Mrs. Ajayi. The stern vice principal walked into the scene, her gaze flickering between Bissy and Mr. Bello, piecing together the situation in an instant. The room was silent. Bissy could feel her entire world crumbling before her eyes. The mask of perfection she had so carefully crafted was now hanging by a thread, and that thread had just been severed by the look on Mrs. Ajayi's face. "What is going on here?" Mrs. Ajayi's voice was so ice-cold, her eyes narrowing as she stepped further into the office, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Bissy couldn't find the words to answer. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mr. Bello, for his part, looked pale and rattled, clearly panicked at having been caught. "Bissy, come with me," Mrs. Ajayi said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Bissy's legs felt like lead as she moved toward the door. As she passed Mrs. Ajayi, she could feel the weight of her disappointment, and with every step she took, the reality of what had just happened hit her like a wave. This was it. Her secret was out. The walk to the headmistress' office was the longest of Bissy's life. Her feet dragged along the corridor, her mind spinning as she imagined the scandal that was about to unfold. By the time they reached the headmistress' office, the whispers had already begun. Bissy could see students exchanging glances, their faces etched with curiosity and disbelief. The rumor was spreading, and by nightfall, the entire school would know. Inside the headmistress' office, the atmosphere was suffocating. Mrs. Ajayi stood beside the headmistress, her arms still crossed, while Bissy sat silently in front of the large mahogany desk. "I'm disappointed, Bissy," the headmistress finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was measured, but the disappointment was evident. "The school has rules, and we expect our students to uphold the highest standard of integrity. Bissy's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. She could feel tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, but she held them back. She had to remain strong, even if everything around her was falling apart. We will launch an investigation into Mr. Bellow's conduct, but it is clear that you have been involved in inappropriate activities with several members of the staff, the headmistress continued. As a result, you will not be allowed to sit for your final exams, and you will be expelled from the school. The words hit Bissy like a sledgehammer. Expelled. Her future, everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, was gone in an instant. The next few days were a blur for Bissy. Her expulsion became the talk of the school. Her name whispered in every hallway and dormitory. Girls who had once looked up to her now spoke of her with contempt, shaking their heads at how the Queen of Emerald Valley had fallen. Funke, the girl who had once admired her, was the first to confront her. "Why, Bissy?" she asked one evening, her voice thick with disappointment. "We all thought you were perfect. I wanted to be like you. But this?" Bissy didn't have an answer. What could she say? That she had been desperate? That she had traded everything for a false sense of success? Nothing she could say would erase what she had done. As she packaged her bags, ready to leave the school, Bissy felt a deep sense of loss. Leaving Emerald Valley was the hardest thing Bissy had ever done. As she stepped out of the gate for the final time, her suitcase trailing behind her, she wondered what would come next. Her parents had been devastated by the news of her expulsion, and facing them would be another challenge entirely. As she looked up at the wide open road ahead, Bissy knew one thing for certain: she would never make the same mistake again. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you will enjoy this one. It's about a girl who sacrificed her life to come back as a ghost and take revenge on the people who killed her triplet sisters. Thank you for watching.